This video will be a brief guide to the Chicago style of citation. Chicago style of citation is currently on its 17th edition and is one of the most commonly used styles in the political studies field. There are two versions, notes and bibliography and author date. For this video, we will cover notes and bibliography. Prior to proceeding, however, it is important to note that you should always follow the guidelines given by your professor before consulting this guide. The Chicago style of citation contains a few basic format guidelines. Chicago style dictates that the body of your text should be double-spaced with a font size of 12 and a font that is readable and with margins no less than 1 inch. Remember to always be consistent. For instance, while both Times New Roman and Calibri are acceptable fonts, never mix both. Typically, your word processor should have these specifications as default. Another part of Chicago is that you're often expected to have a title page, but which one is highly dependent on your professor's or your instructor's preferences. In this first example, we can see that the title page is on the first page of the assignment. In this scenario, the title should be centered at the top of the first page of the text, and here in the header, it should include your student number, course information, the instructor's name, and the date the assignment is due. In this second example, the title page has its own page. In this scenario, the title should be centered 1/3 down from the top of the page. It should have your name, student number, course information, and the date the assignment is due, and should be double-spaced on each line. Both are acceptable, but your professor will most likely want one in particular. Like every style of citation, every claim you make will require a corresponding citation to back up your claims. Chicago uses in-text citations, which are given with small numbers, either footnotes or endnotes. These are at the end of a clause, sentence, or punctuation, which refers the reader to the citation at either the bottom of the corresponding page in the former, or the end of your assignment in the latter. Both notes are acceptable, but your professor may prefer one over the other, and once again, always remember to be consistent with the method you choose. You should not have footnotes and endnotes in the same assignment. Only one or the other. And at the end of your assignment, you'll have to complete a bibliography. The bibliography will be a collection of the notes you use in your assignment, and this will be covered at the end. Here we can see an example from one of my own assignments. Here I create a footnote. As we can see in this sentence, I made a direct quote to a book. At the end of the punctuation, I pressed the footnote button, and down here I filled out my note. Here we can see two examples of notes. This first example is of a book, and the second is of a chapter in an edited book. Edited books differ from regular books in that each chapter or article is written by different authors. You must make sure to cite the author of the chapter you are using. Importantly, we can see that both examples have different versions. This first version is called the long version, or the long note, which must be used at least once and when you first cite your source. The corresponding version is called the shortened note, as seen here. The shortened note can be used for when citing the same source more than once. Remember, however, to use the long version first before using the shortened version. And lastly, we have ibid. If citing the same source 2 or more times in a note, you can use the word ibid instead. If you're referencing the same source but different page, you can use ibid with comma and the new page numbers. Here we can see an example of an academic journal and an online web page. And lastly, here we can see an example of a social media note. In this case, we use Twitter. When using a direct quote that exceeds 5 lines or more than 100 words, we use what is called a block quote. The block quote is not enclosed with quotation marks, and it begins on a new line. The block quote is indented to make what looks like a block, and it's single-spaced. And finally, here we have the bibliography. As mentioned already, you will be required to create a bibliography at the end of your assignment. This is a collection of all the sources that you have used in your assignment. Here we can see an example of a bibliography created with all the previous examples given in this presentation. These references will correspond to the sources used in your paper and the notes you have already created. Importantly, however, remember that in the bibliography, your sources are sorted alphabetically and the last name of the author is always put first, unless there is no author, in which case the title is used. If there are multiple authors, the first author's name is listed as last name and then first name, while the following authors are listed first name and the last name. Some basic things to keep in mind for your bibliography is that it is created on a separate page and is entitled as bibliography and centered and bolded at the top of your page. Your sources will be single-spaced, and after every line you will use what is called a hanging indent, as seen in the example on the right. You do this by highlighting one source and following the example on the right. This indents every line after the first one in your source. Here are some examples once again for bibliography entries. Here's one for a book, and here's one for an edited chapter in a book. Here we have one for academic journals, and one for online web pages. And lastly, of course, social media, and in this example we use Twitter.